Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, in my case, the Yugambeh, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. The Women in Work Parliamentary Friendship Group is a very important one. Its aim is to facilitate apolitical discussion and promotion of gender issues in public policy and draw on the experience and opinion of women. And great to see we've got a token man there, Stephen, online, our economist, our house economist. Wonderful to have you on the line. We just had someone else join, and who was that? My screen changed. There's a couple there. Mate me Brooke has joined us. Certainly drawing on the opinions of women, stakeholders and, of course, parliamentarians. The Parliamentary Friendship Group has a focus on women's economic security, relying on economic security for women and its member organisations to raise awareness of the many issues facing women today in terms of economic security. I would like to also acknowledge the co-conveners of the Parliamentary Friendship Group on Women and Work, and that is Sharon Claydon and Senator Larissa Waters. And Larissa, the Senator, is an apology for today, couldn't join us. Also, Rosalind Anderson, who's on the line, the eS4W's chair, and eS4W, Economic Security for Women's chair, and one of the following members of the founding members, of the alliance. So thank you very much for being with us today, Rosalind. It's great to see you again. We have a couple of guest speakers as well. Stephen Koukoulas, Economic Security for Women economists and residents on policy reforms. Again, he was here at Southport Yacht Club in sunny Moncrief. And the residents on policy reforms needed to boost women's financial wellbeing as we learn, of course, to live with COVID-19, which has made everything that much more difficult. The other guest speaker we have is Bianca Hazelman. Hartke Hazelman, is that correct?
Hartke Hazelman.
Hartke Hazelman, founder and chief executive officer of Finance Women's Index On, is what I have here. So if we, with no further ado, I'd like to go to our first guest speaker because I know I'm very cognizant today of all of your time restraints, and we're all about listening to our resident economist, Stephen Koukoulas from eS4W. So, Stephen, if you would like to address the forum, we would appreciate that.
Thank you, Angie. And look, I really appreciate the opportunity to give a bit of an update over, well, the last couple of years in a sense, not just with the COVID-19 issues, although they're front and centre of everyone's thinking right now, but how things have evolved and some issues that are still confronting this quest and this task and this challenge of getting greater economic security for women, because there's mixed news on it. And of course, the COVID-19 issue has come along just to cloud the story. Now, I'm going to share my PowerPoint with you because I've got a few slides. Okay, well, what I'll do is I'll kick off, and I've narrowed it down because what we did in the last month or so was to give an update on the white paper that we produced back in 2018 to take account of new events. 2 years is a long time in economics and in politics, of course. And the numbers come out, the effects of previous reforms show up in various bits of data. And so we're able to sort of track whether there's been much in the way of progress in economic security for women. Now, the main focus is going to be in the first part of my 20 minutes on the COVID issues. And it's really quite interesting to see how payrolls, the Bureau of Statistics have started calculating payrolls data. It's a little bit different to the labour force survey because this relies on tax office data, but the overlap is remarkably similar. And as you can see where the two arrows are pointing down, which is the change from the 14th of March, so effectively before the COVID issue completely blew up, to the latest data, which just was released last week to the 5th of September on payroll jobs. And you can see there that over that 6-month period, male payrolls numbers are down by about 5%. For women, it's down only, in inverted commas, 4.3%. So what was initially a bigger shock to female job creation has partly reversed. And if we look at the very right-hand column where the second arrow is, the change in total wages, so how much money is going into people's pay packets every week. For men, it's down 6.7%. So that implies that with employment down 5%, wages are down by even greater amount, they're working fewer hours, almost by definition, or they're having pay cuts, one or the other. We don't know the details just yet. So men, as we sit here and now, have been hit harder, if you like, than women, because the women's total wage payments are only down about 0.9%. And that is because they're working longer. When we look at some of the industry by industry data, and even just our lived experience, dare I say it, we know that in a sense, the driving force behind our coping with COVID-19, or a couple of the issues, have been healthcare, quite obviously, and that's a female-dominated profession within the economy, and education, certainly for preschool, school age, not counting universities at this stage. That's been holding up remarkably well, and they tend to be female-dominated sectors. So when we think about, well, why is it so? Why is this particularly the case? I think it's a skewing of the professions that have been arguably a little more resilient as the dust has settled, I suppose, from this COVID recession. And here's a chart which actually shows these numbers sort of each fortnight that the Bureau of Statistics do them. The solid blue line is the male payrolls numbers. The grey line is females. And as you can see, in that first month or two, when the payrolls for women dropped almost 10% by the time we got to the end of April, that was where we were seeing this deterioration in equality between men and women in terms of paid work. But then the rebound occurred as we learnt to do homeschooling. Teachers were teaching from home. The health professionals were being employed. Female employment recovered much more quickly than male employment. We're even at the point now where approximately male employment has not improved much from that low point in the latter part of April, whereas female employment has improved. And that recent tilting down you've just seen over the last couple of months in those two lines is Victoria. That's the shutdown that's impacted both men and women. So in a sense, when we're looking at the longer run effects, not just the knee-jerk reaction as the economy shut down completely back in March and April and even into May, that there's been no significant deterioration between men and women in terms of employment and wages. And if anything, there's been a slight change, whether that's just a temporary blip when we look back in history at 2020 and see the dreaded COVID-19 effect on a lot of economic data is still very, very unclear. But nonetheless, there's some preliminary information that's coming through there. Now, in dollar terms, this is the chart which actually shows that average weekly earnings on a full-time equivalent basis for men, the diamonds, dare I say it, the females, which are the squares, and the circles are the sort of total persons, if you like. And you can see that over the last 4.5 years or 5 years or so, there's the pay gap. It doesn't look as if it's closed much at all. There is a chart that Wygia and others put out, which is still a very good chart, but it sort of exacerbates the sort of short-term movements in wages. And it does show the pay gap narrowing and from about 15% to about 14%. And that's a welcome change. But if we look at the actual hard dollars and cents, there's still a $315 a week difference between male and female full-time equivalent cash earnings. So that those previous numbers that I mentioned will not be showing up in this particular indicator yet. So so there's still a wage gap there. Progress has been slow, whichever way we cut and dice it. Now, this is a chart that really made me genuinely upset. And I think it's worth including in here, even though our focus tends to be economic security, this is a mental health issue. Again, the Bureau of Statistics, to their credit, and they deserve 10 out of 10 as being really agile in terms of how they're collecting data during this crisis. And whoever decided that, 10 out of 10 for them. But the ABS are one of the, from an economist's perspective, one of the heroes. Now, this is a simple survey that they did about how COVID is impacting on your emotional and mental health well-being during this time of COVID-19. Pale blue males, dark blue females. And when I saw these data came through, I thought I'd include them because they're, again, part of this whole process, I think, of trying to, there are economic consequences from poor mental health. And you can look at the numbers here so the number of people who felt nervous about COVID, well, it was approximately 50% women, 41% men. So a lot of people of both genders are nervous, but again, more women by almost 9 percentage points. Feeling hopeless. Gosh, 26% of women and 21% of men felt hopeless because of COVID. Restless and fidgety, high numbers there. Everything was an effort, again, high numbers. And of course, that might relate to some of the being stuck at home and not being able to go to work and these sorts of things. And the last two actually were really, remarkably sobering to me. They felt so depressed that nothing could cheer them up. And that was where men were slightly higher numbers than women. But again, about 16 or 17% of the population. Gosh, 1 in 6 people. It's extraordinary.
Out of how many were actually surveyed, Stephen?
I'd have to double check the bureau. It was a big sample size. I think it was multiple thousands. I think the ABS undertook a special research into these sorts of feelings, and then so it was a big sample. I think there's robustness in the data. Again, like most of the polls, because the ABS is just doing polls, there's probably a margin of error of about 3 percentage points. Would be my educated guess on this. And then feelings of worthlessness, again, similar numbers, 14 and 17%. So when we look at how people are coping with COVID, and again, I didn't see a state-by-state split on this, but I dare say people in Victoria, when you see them chatting on social media and the like, you can see how many of them are feeling really disillusioned. These sorts of numbers are sort of just highlighting to us that how difficult the mental health challenges are here from COVID-19. And again, I think it's something we need to bear in mind when we think about what policy reforms we could be looking at to improve the economy, to make sure that people can get back to work. And while it's not for me to say, because this is a health challenge more than an economic challenge, how do we learn to live with COVID? Are we going to wait until we actually get a definitive vaccine? Are we going to do what that we're seeing in most states and territories, impose of course, all the social distancing, hand washing, these sorts of things, and sort of live with it? Or are we going to have to, therefore, except some people will get it? Now, unfortunately, of course, some people will die from it. Or will we have the sort of, what do we call it, the hard-headed approach and lockdown until we eliminate it? That's for other people to decide, of course. But again, I really wanted to highlight this. And as I was going through my ABS database, this sort of jumped out at me as something that we should chat about. Now, I've only got 2 slides left because, again, this is another thing that popped up. This was included in our white paper of last month, of August this year. You may have heard of Essential Research Polling Company. They're just one of the many polling companies that do research on who you're going to vote for and who's the better economic manager. Yeah, just the usual sort of stuff. But every couple of weeks they include different questions on different aspects of society. And in June, just 3 or 4 months ago, they had a survey on gender issues. And again, this was, another striking thing to me. They're asking questions about people's attitudes to gender issues. And I found it confronting again, particularly with my eS4W hat on and how we're going to be addressing the gender equality issues, that only 80% of people said there should be laws to pay men and women the same salaries for the same job. Now, of course, 80% is a big number, but by definition, 20% of people don't think men and women should be paid the same salaries for the same job. That's a lot. 56% of people said work to achieve gender equality benefits mostly well-to-do people, was the phrase that Essential used in their question. Now, again, as Rosalind and Sharon and I have seen different roundtable discussions in Launceston, WA and Adelaide and around the country over the last few years, I would disagree strongly with that. Of course, we don't want to drag highly successful women down. On the contrary, we want to make sure that they do well. But gender equality strikes me as something impacting people who are finding real financial stress. They're really the unpaid carer part of the society, those working fewer hours than they would like to do. So in a sense, the efforts to improve gender equality, you're running into over half the population who thinks that it only benefits rich people or well-to-do people. So that's another confronting statistic. Then the other part, which again was amazing, is that 51% said that gender equality has been mostly achieved. So if half the population think that, well, the question's got to be, well, how do we actually convince them that gender societal and economic policy? And then 47% said that gender equality, meaning men and women are equal, had already come far enough. So there's 40% of the population that even with a reasonably well-framed argument or a very well-framed argument say, well, hey, why are we worrying about gender equality? We've already come far enough. And when Essential broke it down by gender, no surprises, I guess, for everyone on this call, that on that first question, should they be paid the same? It was 75% of men said yes. Amazingly, I thought 85% of women said yes. So 15% of women don't think men and women should be paid the same, which was curious. Then that gender equality mostly benefits well-to-do people. Again, men were in the majority, thinking that gender equality is skewed towards well-off as opposed to middle and lower socioeconomic groups. But still 53% of women thought that. Then the question of gender equality has been mostly achieved. 61% of men said yes, but still 42% of women. But the gaps there, you can see, opened up to 19 percentage points between the two genders on that question. And then that final question, gender equality, meaning men and women are equal, has already come far enough. 57% of men said it's gone far enough, and even 36% of women said it's gone far enough. So I wanted to include those in the discussion today, and for everyone on the call to go away and think about and how we address these issues. But as one of the issues that since I've been associated with eS4W for 2.5 years, I've been going on about is that it's important that we bring the whole of society along on our quest for gender equality issues. That it's very hard if people disagree with you or aren't aware of the problems or aren't exposed to the issues associated with a particular issue, and in our case, it's economic security for women, they're going to be uninspired about pushing for change. If they can see the pay gap, the superannuation gap, affordable and accessible childcare issues, unpaid care workers, that myriad of issues, financial education, the financial literacy issues. If they're unaware of these being a concern, they're going to be harder to convince to be advocates for change, let alone those in power. And I appreciate everyone on the call who's in a position of power to make changes in economic policy and these sort of issues. It's important when you're advocating these changes that you're aware that, first of all, here's a good policy idea. But if you've got half the population thinking, well, why are you bringing me a gender equality proposal when I reckon we've already gone far enough, or that it only benefits well-to-do people, then you're going to be banging your head against the wall and making it very, very hard to achieve. So I guess that's the end of my presentation. It was always my biggest challenge is to get the amount of facts I want to into a particular issue. So that's it from me. I look forward to any other questions. I'll hand back to you, Angie, and then Bianca. So thank you very much for that.
So now we'd like to hear from our next guest speaker, Bianca Hartsch. Did I get it right? No, sorry.
No, doesn't matter. Bianca Hartsch-Hazelman.
Hartsch-Hazelman. Bianca, great to hear from you. We'd like you to now present your presentation from FINANCY Women's Index.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be presenting this to this group, and I'm hoping to be able to do that a lot more in the future. I've been authoring the FINANCY Women's Index for 3 years now. It's now modelled by, I work with Deloitte Access Economics to create it every quarter. It's reviewed by the Australian Bureau of Statistics every quarter because I use a lot of their data. I have a number of economists that I work with that are part of the board, and just about to add the Grattan Institute to that too, which is very exciting. These are people, including myself, that are passionate about change on economic equality in this country. So we are the only place that is measuring and tracking financial progress of women and in terms of a score and the time frame to economic equality on a quarterly basis in this country. So I'll show you what the FINANCY Women's Index is in the hope of showing you what we've found throughout COVID and and I'm going to discuss some of the challenges and new strategies that you could potentially look at. I'm big on that we do need change, that we need a mindset change, a DNA change in Australian culture that comes with setting actual new neuro pathways. And our language is key to that in terms of being more positive language rather than the defensive language that is getting on people's nerves. So there's a scientific solution there that I'm proposing. The FINANCY Women's Index was created and launched in 2017 on International Women's Day to try and make sense of all the data that's coming through on the gender pay gap, on the superannuation gap, on leadership gaps and things like that in the workplace, on education gaps, on unpaid work gaps. All of this data that gives you a mental overload. Now, I, prior to starting this, was a full-time journalist at the Australian Financial Review for many years. I've interviewed Stephen many times before, and I just found myself frustrated at the paper, which I still love very much today, that paper, but frustrated that I couldn't do more reporting on women's issues, which were just coming front and centre all the time to me. And I became a mum, and then they were becoming amplified. I've now got 3 daughters, so I feel it's something that I'm obsessed about and I write about on a daily basis for women, and I will continue to do so until I'm not on this planet. So basically, the Women's Index looks at education, paid work, unpaid work, pay outcomes, the gender pay gap, leadership and wealth through superannuation. We're putting all that together into a score just to make it digestible. And if I go back to that previous screen, and I just remind people of this, that if you aren't measuring it, you can't manage it, you can't fix it. That's a famous quote from Michael Bloomberg on perhaps why he started Bloomberg and tracking and all the different measures for doing that through Bloomberg. So what does it look like, economic equality in Australia? Well, without a doubt, what we've found is that for every month of COVID, if we start at March and we look just at the June quarter, so there's 3 months there, for every month, it has added 1 year, 1 year's delay to that time frame to achieving economic equality. We look at these measurements. So you've got unpaid work on your screen, the participation rate, the underemployment rate, employment, those full-time numbers, gender pay gap, super, ASX number of women on ASX top 200 boards. These are years to achieving parity here when we look at these numbers of men relative to women. So it's blown out to 36 years. So we say 36 years to achieving economic equality because we're taking the one with the longest time frame. And that's if the constant rate of progress continues. And it has been improving in recent quarters. It absolutely has been. And then we hit COVID, and suddenly we've got to a point where the initial impact of COVID hit women hardest. And even though we've seen a recovery somewhat in those employment numbers, I'll draw your attention to something that hasn't changed. It's going to make it a lot harder for women to move forward and to lift that participation. So 36 years till we see economic equality in this country based on employment numbers, and that's 3 to 4 years added to the time frame because of COVID just at the start of this year. So the longer this goes on, the harder it's going to be to achieve economic equality in this country. We need it from an economic point of view. I think the financial impacts, Grattan's done a lot of work on this, McKinsey's done a lot of work on this, on the economic benefits. Unfortunately, we don't value unpaid work in this country, so women feel undervalued. And if we were valuing that, we could actually put that in GDP figures and see probably a bigger number for us if we started to do that. That's another discussion. So this is what the index looks like. If you can see the green line has been ticking up as we're moving closer to parity, that economic equality score. Now, we had progress for women in the June quarter, and you might say, well, how was that, given that COVID hit women's joblessness more so than men? It actually hit, the initial impact was harder on wages for women than it was men. We saw a slight pullback in the gender pay gap at the start of the year. So why was that? Now, what we had, I'm jumping forward here, is the biggest thing that I saw was that the gender gap in the underemployment rate, women's underemployment has always been about double that of men's. And that's the number of women who, basically, I'm summarising here, want to work, have the capacity to work, but for whatever reason, they are unable to work at the ultimate capacity. So where they are unable to realise their full potential. What's happening here with COVID is we've got more men in that boat. So the gap between women and men has narrowed, giving the illusion that women have actually progressed because outcomes for men have become that much worse, as we've seen unfold in the September quarter ABS data for men in particular. So this has created this sense that, you know, women have progressed in the June quarter financially because a gender gap has narrowed, but we're progressing at the expense of men in some point of view, which isn't the way we want to achieve economic progress and equality in this country. And I expect this spike, and I know Stephen could add to this, will probably unravel. We tend to see these spikes in indexes, and we probably will see this one start to unravel. So the biggest thing that for me, in addition, if we look at paid work, is that COVID has reversed 2 years of full-time employment growth for women. Women's full-time work participation has been outpacing men for decades, and we have seen men's part-time work participation outpace women. So there's been a structural shift. There's potentially been this family shift on caring responsibilities, more flexible work has come into play. These things have been happening. They've been very real. But because of COVID, we're now back in time 2 years. My look at the latest numbers, we're back in time. We've made up some ground. We're back in time about 18 months for women in terms of those full-time employment numbers. So less women are participating in full-time work. Even though we've had a recovery and women have started to, when Stephen showed that last graph, we've got more men experiencing joblessness. The number of full-time to male full-time employment numbers, men are still only down about a year's worth of, they're back in time about a year in terms of those full-time employment numbers. Women are still back. We've still got a hell of a lot more ground to make up. And the problem with this is if we're going to lift economic growth, if we're going to achieve economic equality, if we're going to further support women into the workforce and realise this unrealised potential, we have to make up a lot of lost ground because of COVID. And this is a problematic for the Australian story of achieving economic equality. The biggest barriers that I see where gender gaps are likely to worsen because of COVID are in unpaid work. This is, I've made a chart out of a survey that was conducted by the Melbourne University. A couple of professors did that. Now, the Hilda survey data comes in as part of one of the feeding sources of information on unpaid work for the FINANCY Women's Index. But because that data is lagging, we will see that out in hopefully this September or December quarter. I've looked at, well, what is smaller sample data showing us? And it's showing us that the volume of men are now doing more unpaid work at the same level as women were before COVID. So that's a good thing, you might say, but women are doing far more unpaid work beyond what they were doing, far beyond what they were doing before COVID, across all activities. So that's paid work, housework, primary care activities, and those supervisory activities. So our ability to participate in the working economy is being hampered by the burden of unpaid work, is being further obstructed by childcare system that is not like the education system that is free. We need to learn from what we saw early in COVID and the release that gave many women in being able to participate, and potentially that improvement, that recovery story that we have seen, and ask ourselves, did that free childcare have a role to play? And I suspect we might find out that it did. So there's a few barriers that are really affecting women, and unpaid work and childcare is a huge one if we are to address this 2-year lag gap that we are now in with women in work participation. Just another thing where I expect gender gaps could worsen is in superannuation, and that is dependent on the longer this goes on, this story, for women not participating in the workforce as much, because that impacts wages, that impacts your ability to earn super. So Australian Super provides their membership data to the FINANCY Women's Index every 6 months. The latest round of data showed that the gender gap for their membership, which is Australia's biggest superannuation fund, has actually widened. That's a problem. So we've had over this period the ability to access your super more, although I know Treasury figures are showing that more men have accessed their super early than women. But at the same time, you've got less women in the paid workforce. So it's creating this situation where this gender gap story is widening, which is going to create bigger problems for us down the line if we don't have measures in place to start helping people rebuild their superannuation. So there are real, as Stephen said, real economic consequences to what is going on, real progress concerns that I have to what is going on. The things that I feel that will really start to address what has been happening. There are 5 simple things that I see that, yes, might sound simple, I know are harder to achieve, but they are really programs in schools. We need to change attitudes and mindsets when it comes to gender. That is something that needs to change. We need to look at when children are most exposed to these gender stereotypes that's been set in our DNA in many ways, that sees women potentially seeing themselves as lesser than men, or potentially not aware of the issues that are happening until they have children. So we need to empower and educate both genders on what those are so we can bridge that knowledge gap there. And I believe that should be happening in schools. So there's campaigns of awareness also that need to happen around, for example, domestic violence is a big one, particularly at the moment. We've got a rise of that as a result of COVID, which is just absolutely devastating. The campaigns that I see around gender are just as important in valuing and respecting each other from a positive point of view. And also, when we think about things like domestic violence, that has a profound impact on the economic security of women, and not just domestic violence, financial abuse as well. But it also creates, the whole story around that creates an unfortunate perception that tarnishes men. That tarnishes men that don't actually do this. And I was thinking about this. I actually whacked myself with a ladder, not a ladder, a rake in the garden yesterday when I was with my mother. And she made the odd comment to me, someone's going to think your husband whacked you in the face. And I thought that's a horrible thing for men, for our society to assume if there is a woman hurt, to think that, well, there's so many women that unfortunately 1 woman a week dies because of domestic violence. We have an obligation to men as well to start changing the conversation here, not just for the safety and security of women and future generations, but also to celebrate men who are actually doing who are actually respectable to women as a nation as well. So there's a need to change campaigns of awareness on many fronts there that impact the economic security for women. Policy change, without a doubt, will affect all those. Leading by example, we need that at a government level and a business level. And as I've just alluded to, celebrating the success stories. These are 5 things that I see as absolutely critical to achieving economic equality in this country and strengthening economic security for women.